Did you know that in their first major engagement against the German war machine, the United States Army did not just stumble, they were absolutely butchered? In the span of a single week in February 1943, nearly 200 American tanks were turned into burning coffins. 3,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or went missing. An entire corps was routed, fleeing in panic, abandoning equipment that had taken months to ship across the Atlantic. The world looked at the rising American superpower and saw incompetence. The Germans looked at them and saw amateurs. The myth of industrial inevitability shattered against the reality of tactical superiority. My name is Conrad Vance, and this is my video about the collision of the two most celebrated tank commanders in history in the unforgiving killing fields of Tunisia. We are going to walk through the mud and the blood of North Africa. We are going to sit inside the cramping, deafening hull of a Sherman tank as it faces down a tiger for the first time. We will dissect the logistical strangulation that doomed one army and the ruthless discipline that resurrected another. This is not a story of glory. It is a story of how a humiliated force learned the terrifying calculus of modern armor warfare the hard way. February 14th, 1943, 0630 hours. Sidi Bouzid, Tunisia. The morning air is not hot, it is freezing. A biting wind sweeps off the jagged peaks of the Atlas Mountains, cutting through the thin field jackets of the men of the U.S. 1st Armored Division. They are waiting. They are watching the Fide Pass to the east. Visibility is poor. A sandstorm is brewing, mixing with the morning mist to create a shifting gray wall. Private First Class. James Miller shivers in his foxhole. He is 19 years old. He has been in the Army for 6 months. He has been told that the German Army is overstretched. He has been told that the Afrika Korps is running out of fuel. He has been told that his M4 Sherman is the best tank in the world. He believes these things because he has to. Then the wind shifts. The sound comes first. A low, grinding rumble that you feel in your teeth before you hear it with your ears. It is the sound of Maybach engines. It is the sound of steel tracks chewing up the desert floor. Out of the mist they appear. Not a few scouts, not a probing force. Dozens of them. Panzer IVs with the long barrel 75mm guns. And behind them, the monsters, the tigers. 60 tons of hardened steel that the American 37mm anti-tank guns will bounce off of, like pebbles thrown at a bank vault. The American tanks move to engage. They follow the doctrine they learned in the training grounds of Louisiana. They move into the open. They stop to fire. It is a massacre. The German gunners, veterans of Poland, France, and the endless desert war against the British, do not miss. They fire on the move. They utilize the terrain. They flank. In minutes, the horizon is dotted with the black, oily smoke of burning American armor. The radio chatter dissolves from orderly commands into screaming confusion. Men are bailing out of their turrets, their uniforms on fire, rolling in the sand. This was the Battle of Sidi Bouzid. It was the prelude to the disaster at Kasserine Pass. It was the moment the United States learned that production charts and factory output do not win battles. Men do. Systems do, and in the spring of 1943, the German system was still the deadliest predator on Earth. To understand why this happened and how the tide eventually turned, we have to pull back. We have to look at the map. We have to understand the chessboard before we can understand the players. Zoom out. It is early 1943. The war in North Africa has been raging for 3 years. For most of that time, it was a pendulum swinging back and forth across the Libyan desert. The British 8th Army against the German Afrika Korps. Rommel pushes to Egypt, Montgomery pushes him back. Rommel pushes again, Montgomery pushes back. It was a war of supply lines. But in November 1942, the equation changed. Operation Torch. The Allies landed in Morocco and Algeria. Tens of thousands of American and British troops poured onto the beaches, opening a second front in the rear of the Axis forces. The strategic goal was simple. Trap Rommel, crush the Afrika Korps between the British 8th Army coming from the east and the new Anglo-American force coming from the west. Squeeze them into the tip of Tunisia and push them into the sea. It looked good on paper. Tunisia is not the open desert of Libya. It is a country of jagged mountains, running north to south like the spine of a prehistoric beast. The coast is fertile and wet. The interior is arid and broken. Between the mountains are the chats, vast salt lakes that turn into impassable marshes when it rains. And it rains a lot in winter. The roads are few. They are narrow. They wind through steep passes where a single disabled truck can block movement for hours. This is defensive terrain. It is a nightmare for an attacker. The Germans reacted with lightning speed. As the Allies fumbled with politics and logistics in Algiers, the Germans poured reinforcements into Tunisia. They seized the ports of Bizerte and Tunis. They established a bridgehead. They dug in. By January 1943, the race to the sea was over. The stalemate had begun. The two armies faced each other along the eastern dorsal of the Atlas Mountains. To the west, the inexperienced Americans spread thin, cold, and confident. To the east, the veteran Germans. Consolidated, desperate, and dangerous. The man commanding the German forces was Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. By 1943, Rommel was a physically broken man. He was suffering from nasal diphtheria, rheumatism, and chronic stomach ailments. He was exhausted. He had been fighting without pause for 2 years. He watched his supply ships get sunk by the Royal Navy and Allied aircraft day after day. He knew the strategic situation was hopeless. He knew that eventually the weight of American numbers would crush him. But Rommel was not a man to wait for the end. He was a tactician of movement. He understood that his only chance, his only hope of delaying the inevitable, or perhaps forcing a negotiated stalemate, was to strike. He had to hit the Americans before they could learn. He had to break their morale. He had to shatter their confidence so thoroughly that they would become cautious. He looked at the American dispositions, and he saw weakness. The U.S. II Corps was strung out over hundreds of miles. Their units were mixed up. Their commanders were operating from command posts far to the rear, relying on telephone lines that the Arabs cut every night. They were positioning their troops in small packets, trying to defend everything, which meant they could defend nothing. Rommel saw ripe fruit hanging low. On the other side was the U.S. Army, a giant waking up from a 20-year nap. The last time the American Army had fought a major war. They rode horses and walked. Now they were mechanized. But mechanization is not just about giving a man a tank. It is about the system that supports that tank. It is about fuel, parts, ammunition, recovery vehicles, radios, and the coordination of artillery and air power. The Americans had the stuff. They had the trucks. The 2.5-ton truck, the Deuce and a Half, was the envy of every German general. They had the jeeps. They had the rations. They had the uniforms. They had chocolate and cigarettes. What they did not have was experience. You cannot simulate the terror of being shelled in a training exercise. You cannot teach a man how to prioritize targets when his friends are screaming over the radio in a classroom. The American officers were rigid. They followed the field manuals. They believed that if they followed the steps written in the book, they would win. They did not understand that the enemy gets a vote. The equipment was another shock. The American M4 Sherman was a good tank. It was reliable. It was fast. It had a gyro stabilizer that allowed it to fire somewhat accurately on the move. In 1942, it was arguably the best all-around tank in the world. But the Germans had introduced the Tiger, the Panzer VI. The Tiger weighed 57 tons. Its frontal armor was 100 millimeter thick. Its 88-liter gun could kill a Sherman at 2,000 yards. The Sherman's 75 mm gun could not penetrate the Tiger's front armor at point-blank range. The disparity created a psychological crisis. Tiger phobia spread through the ranks. Every German tank looked like a Tiger to a terrified gunner. Every Shadow looked like an 88. And so the stage was set for Kasserine. Rommel struck at Sidi Bouzid. He crushed the American armor. Then he kept going. He pushed through the Kasserine Pass, a narrow gap in the western dorsal. The American defense collapsed. Major General Lloyd Fredendall, the commander of II Corps, was miles away in a bunker he had blasted out of E. Ravine, obsessed with air attacks, out of touch with his unit commanders. The Germans broke through. They threatened the huge Allied supply dumps at Tebessa. If they took Tebessa, they could cut the Allied army in half. They could force a retreat all the way back to Algeria. It would be a catastrophe. But Rommel's supply line was a tether he could not break. He ran low on fuel. The terrain, the mud, and stiffening Allied resistance finally halted him. He withdrew. Tactically, it was a German victory. Strategically, it was a turning point, but not in the way Rommel hoped. He had hoped to break the American spirit. Instead, he pissed them off. The shock of Kasserine reverberated all the way to Washington. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, saw the rot. He saw the lack of discipline. He saw the poor leadership. He fired Fredendall, and he sent for George. March 6, 1943. A dusty airstrip in Constantine, Algeria. A C-47 transport plane touches down. The door opens. Out steps Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr. He is wearing highly polished cavalry boots. He is wearing breeches. He has a pair of ivory-handled revolvers strapped to his waist. His helmet is lacquered and shines like glass. His face is set in a scowl that could strip paint. He does not look like a man who has come to negotiate. He looks like a man who has come to conquer. Patton was the anti-Rommel. Where Rommel was the improviser, the lead from the front tactician who relied on speed and surprise, Patton was the master of violence. He believed in the offensive. He believed in attacking, always attacking, but he also believed in discipline. He took command of the U.S. II Corps on March 6th. The transformation was immediate. It was violent. Patton walked into the headquarters and saw officers without ties. He saw soldiers with unbuttoned tunics. He saw muddy trucks. He saw a defeated army feeling sorry for itself. He issued an order. Everyone, from the cooks to the colonels, would wear their helmets and leggings at all times, even in the rear, even in the latrine. He fined officers for unshaven faces. He screamed at men for dirty boots. The soldiers hated him. They called him old blood and guts. They said, yeah, our blood, his guts. But something happened. The slouching stopped. The uniforms got cleaned. The salutes became crisp. The vehicles were maintained. By focusing on the small details, Patton forced the men to pay attention. He forced them to act like soldiers. And when you act like a soldier, you start to think like a soldier. And when you think like a soldier, you can fight. Patton knew he had a limited window. The British Eighth Army was pushing up from the south. They were hitting the Mareth Line, the German defensive belt in southern Tunisia. Patton's job was to attack from the west. He had to draw German reserves away from the British. He had to threaten the German flank. He had to prove that the American army was not a joke. He looked at the map. He pointed to a spot called El Guetar. It was a valley, a series of ridges and wadis leading east toward the coast. It was defended by the Italian Centauro Division and elements of the 10th Panzer Division. Patton did not care. He issued his orders. We attack. We attack tomorrow. We keep attacking until the enemy breaks. This brings us to the core conflict. The setup is complete. We have the board. We have the pieces. On one side, the Africa Corps, battered, running on captured fuel and stubborn pride, led by officers who have forgotten what it feels like to lose a tactical engagement. They look at the Americans with contempt. They see a mob with money. On the other side, the U.S. II Corps, revitalized by terror and discipline, led by a man who believes he is the reincarnation of Roman legionnaires. They are itching for payback. They want to erase the shame of Kasserine. But wanting it and doing it are two different things. The question hanging over the desert in mid-March. 1943 was simple. Could this new American army, this manufactured force, stand toe-to-toe with the Wehrmacht? Could they handle the complex coordination of artillery, infantry, air power, and armor required to break a fortified position? Or would El Guetar be another slaughter? To understand the answer, we need to look at the tools. We need to look at the machines that would fight this battle. Let's talk about the M4 Sherman. The Sherman gets a bad reputation in history books. People compare it to the Tiger and say it was trash. That is not fair. and it is not true. In 1943, the Sherman was a marvel of automotive engineering. It was reliable. You could drive it for 2,000 miles without a major overhaul. A German Panther tank needed a final drive replacement every 150 kilometers. The Sherman had a power traverse turret. It could spin its gun around in seconds. The German tanks had hand-cranked turrets. If the tank was on a slope, the gunner had to use both arms and all his strength just to turn the gun. The Sherman was comfortable. It had big hatches. It was easy to escape from. This sounds like a small thing, but when your tank is on fire, it is the only thing that matters. The problem was the gun, the 75mm M3 gun. It was a general-purpose weapon. It fired a great high-explosive shell. It could blow up bunkers, kill infantry, and destroy soft targets. But against the frontal armor of a Tiger or the new Panthers, it was a pea shooter. The American doctrine said tanks shouldn't fight tanks. Tanks should exploit breakthroughs. Tank destroyers should fight tanks. This was the fatal flaw in American thinking. The enemy tank does not wait for your tank destroyer to show up. It kills you now. Patton knew this, but he also knew that he had numbers. He had artillery, and he had air power. The Battle of El Guitar would not be a duel between knights. It would be a brawl. March 16, 1943. The rains have stopped. The ground is drying. Patton moves his command post forward. He wants to be close to the action. He sleeps in a truck. He wakes up at 05. He reads his Bible. He puts on his revolvers. He visits the 1st Infantry Division, the big red one. They are the ones who will take the heights. They are light infantry. No tanks. Just rifles, machine guns, and mortars. They have to climb the jagged ridges of the Jebel Burda and the Jebel Ankh to clear the way for the armor. The terrain is moon-like, gray rock, scrub brush, deep ravines. The Italians are dug in on the high ground. They have pre-sighted every path. They have mortar pits defilated behind the crests. At 2 hours on March 17th, the attack begins. There is no artillery preparation. Patton wants surprise. Thousands of men move in the darkness. The only sound is the scuff of boots on rock and the occasional clink of a canteen. They move up the slopes. Suddenly, a flare pops. A magnesium star hanging in the sky. Then the machine guns open up. The Breda Model 37, rapid fire. The tracers cut through the night like laser beams. The Americans drop. They crawl. They throw grenades. They fight hand to hand in the dark. It is brutal, intimate violence. By dawn, the heights are secured. The big red one has done its job. They have opened the door. Now, Patton unleashes the 1st Armored Division. They roll through the valley. Hundreds of tanks. Half-tracks. Self-propelled guns. It is a parade of power. They push east. They take the town of El Guetar. They feel unstoppable. But Rommel, or rather his replacement, General von Arnim, since Rommel had been flown back to Germany for medical treatment just days before, though his plan remained, was waiting. The 10th Panzer Division was hiding in the depressions and wadis further east. They were not Italian conscripts. They were the elite. They waited. They let the American spearhead extend. They let them get confident. Then the trap snapped shut. March 23, 1943. The American 1st Armored Division is advancing. The lead elements spot movement. Tanks front. It is a counterattack. A massive one. 50 panzers supported by infantry and Stuka dive bombers. The Americans deploy. They fan out. But this time, something is different. This time, they don't panic. This time, the American tank destroyers, the M10 Wolverines, move into position. They have the 3-inch gun. It can kill a panzer. This time, the American artillery, the 105mm and 155mm howitzers, are networked. The forward observers call in the coordinates. Fire mission. Battery 1, adjust fire. The air fills with the shriek of incoming shells. The German attack runs into a wall of steel. The artillery does not stop. It walks back and forth over the German formation. It strips away the infantry. It smashes the tracks of the tanks. For the first time in the war, an American force stops a major German armored attack cold. They do not run. They do not break. Patton is watching from a hilltop. He sees the German tanks burning. He sees the Stukas being chased off by American P-40 Warhawks. He lowers his binoculars. He smiles, a wolfish smile. "I love it," he says to his aide. "God help me, I do love it so." But the battle was not over. The Germans were not done. They regrouped. They probed for a weak spot. They found a gap between the 1st Infantry and the 1st Armored. And that is where the real horror began. Because while the machines were fighting in the valley, the men were dying in the hills. The infantry fight for the ridges around El Guitar turned into a meat grinder. Let me take you to Hill 369. It is a rocky knob overlooking the Gabes Road. The Germans know that if they lose this hill, the Americans can fire down on their retreat. They reinforce it with paratroopers from the Hermann Göring Division. These are fanatics. They are young. They are well equipped. The American battalion attacking the hill is understrength. They have been fighting for 3 days. They are out of water. Their lips are cracked and bleeding. Their eyes are sunken. They attack at dawn. They run into a buzzsaw. Sergeant Michael Rossi leads his squad up a ravine. He hears the zip-zip of bullets passing inches from his head. He sees his best friend take a round in the throat and go down without a sound. He throws a grenade. It bounces back. He dives. Explosion. Dust. Screams. Rossi gets up. He is deafened. He moves forward. He sees a German paratrooper rising from a spider hole, leveling a submachine gun. Rossi fires from the hip. The M1 Garand barks twice. The German falls back. Rossi jumps into the hole. He lands on the body. He smells the sweat and the blood. He realizes he is sharing a foxhole with a dead man. And he realizes he is alone. His squad is gone. This is the reality of the Battle of the Titans. It is not just generals moving flags on a map. It is Sergeant Rossi, alone in a hole, waiting for the counterattack, checking his last clip, praying that the artillery knows where he is. The battle for El Guitar dragged on for days. It was a slugfest. Patton kept pushing. The Germans kept holding. But the logistics were telling the final story. Every time a German tank was destroyed, it was gone forever. There were no replacements coming across the Mediterranean. The Royal Navy and the U.S. Army Air Force had strangled the supply lines. Every time an American tank was destroyed, 2 more rolled off a ship in Algiers and drove to the front. It was a war of attrition. And the math was on Patton's side. But math doesn't comfort the men who have to die to prove it. By early April, the German line began to crack. The British 8th Army broke through the Mareth line in the south. The Americans at El Guetar pushed through the passes. The Africa Corps began its final retreat. North, towards Tunis. Towards the sea. They were compressed into a pocket. The Tunisian bridgehead. And this is where the story shifts. This is where we move from the tactical battles of the desert to the annihilation of an army. Because the end of the Africa Corps was not a glorious last stand. It was a humanitarian disaster. As the ring tightened, the German discipline began to fray. Not at the front, where the soldiers fought with suicidal bravery, but in the rear. The ports were bombed day and night. The ships stopped coming. There was no food. There was no water. There was no medicine. Thousands of German and Italian soldiers were crowded into the Cape Bon Peninsula. They looked at the sea. They waited for the evacuation fleet. They waited for the Dunkirk that Hitler had promised. But there were no ships. There was only the sky, filled with Allied planes, and the ground, shaking with the approach of Allied tanks. Patton had been promoted. He was moved to plan the invasion of Sicily. General Omar Bradley took over II Corps for the final kill, but the spirit of the Corps was Patton's. The aggression was Patton's. On May 7, 1943, the Allies entered Tunis. The scenes were surreal. German soldiers, who had terrified the world for 3 years, were driving their own trucks into prisoner-of-war cages. They were directing traffic for the American columns. They were asking for water. They surrendered by the hundreds of thousands. 230,000 Axis soldiers. More than surrendered at Stalingrad. It was the end of the war in Africa. But for the men who survived, it was just the beginning. They had learned to kill. They had learned to survive. They had learned that the tank is a cruel master. They looked across the Mediterranean, towards Sicily, towards Italy, towards Fortress Europe. They knew that El Guitar was just a warm-up. They knew that the tigers would be waiting. They knew that the mountains would be higher, the rivers deeper, and the enemy more desperate. The U.S. Army had graduated. They had passed the test, but the tuition was paid in blood. The question now was, could they take what they learned in the desert and apply it to the fortress of Europe? Could they defeat the German army on its home ground? Patton believed they could. "We have met the enemy," he wrote in his diary, "and we have kicked his ass." But Sergeant Rossi, cleaning his rifle in a quiet olive grove near Bizerte, wasn't thinking about kicking ass. He was thinking about the empty bunks in his tent. He was thinking about the sound of the 88. He was thinking that he was still alive, and he was terrified of how much luck he had used up. April 1943, the Tunisian hills. The map says spring, but the ground says hell. We need to pause the movement of the arrows on the map and zoom in. We need to understand the machinery of the kill, because while Generals Patton and von Arnim were moving divisions, the war was actually being fought by boys inside steel boxes, peering through glass prisms, trying to spot a muzzle flash before they died. Let's look at the disparity. Let's look at the math of survival. Sit in the gunner's seat of a German Tiger Wog. It is spacious compared to other tanks. You have a Carl Zeiss, Termsiel Fernrohr, 9B binocular sight. The optics are clear. They are magnified 2.5 times. They have stadiometric range-finding triangles. A good German gunner can estimate the range to a target within 50 meters just by looking at how much of the triangle the enemy tank fills. You are stationary. You are hull down, behind a ridge. You see an American Sherman moving across the valley floor. It is 1/800 meters away, a mile and a bit. In 1943, hitting a moving target at that range is supposed to be impossible. The German gunner traverses the turret. The hydraulic traverse is smooth. He lays the crosshair. He accounts for the flight time of the shell. Feuer. The 80 Miata KWK-36 gun fires. The recoil is massive, but the tank barely rocks. The suspension absorbs it. The shell leaves the barrel at 930 meters per second. It crosses the valley in under 2 seconds. The American crew never hears the shot. The shell travels faster than sound. Impact. The Tiger's armor-piercing capped ballistic cap. APC-BC shell punches through the front glacis of the Sherman like a hot needle through wax. It doesn't just make a hole. It creates a pressure wave inside the tank. It turns the interior air into a concussive hammer. It sprays spalling, fragments of the tank's own armor, around the inside of the turret like a shotgun blast. Then the ammunition ignites. The Sherman carries nearly 100 rounds of 75mm ammunition. In early 1943, this ammunition is stored in dry bins in the sponsons, right above the tracks. It is vulnerable. When the propellant catches fire, it burns with the intensity of a blowtorch. The tank doesn't just burn, it erupts. This was the reality every single day in April 1943. The Germans had the technological edge in the engagement envelope. They could kill from further away than they could be killed. So how do you beat that? How did the U.S. Army, still green, still learning, overcome a weapon system that was statistically superior? You don't do it with better tanks. You do it with better systems. This is where the story pivots from the duel to the factory. Patton understood that he couldn't win a sniping match. He had to overwhelm the system. He had to use the one thing the Germans didn't have: abundance. Let's look at the logistics. The Afrika Korps was starving. Not for food, though that was short, but for the blood of mechanized warfare, fuel. A panzer division on the move consumes 30,000 gallons of fuel a day. By April, Rommel's successors were lucky to get 10,000. They were siphoning gas from disabled trucks to run their Tigers. The Americans? They were building a pipeline. Literally. Engineers were laying pipe from the ports to the front lines, and they had the jerry can. This is a micro detail that explains a macro victory. The Germans invented the Wehrmacht Einheitskanister. It was a masterpiece of stamped steel engineering. It had 3 handles, so you could carry 2 in one hand empty, or 1 in each hand full. It poured without. Glugging. It didn't leak. The Americans copied it, they reversed engineered it, and then they mass-produced millions of them. Suddenly, the U.S. Army could move fuel faster, cleaner, and more reliably than the Germans, who were struggling to get their own invention back across the sea. But fuel alone doesn't kill tigers. High explosives do. This brings us to the Time on Target mission. The U.S. artillery had a secret weapon. It wasn't a bigger gun. It was a slide rule and a telephone network. In the German army, an artillery battery fired when it was ready. Shells would land one by one, or battery by battery. The first shell warned you. You dove for cover. The rest did less damage. The Americans developed a fire direction center system. A forward observer would call in a target. Coordinates 445-678, infantry in the open. The FDC would calculate the firing solution for not just one battery, but for every gun within range. 12 battalions, 144 guns. They calculated the time of flight. For each gun, the guns further away fired first. The guns closer fired last. The math was calibrated so that every single shell from all 144 guns arrived at the target at the exact same second. TOT. Time on target. Imagine you are a German grenadier on a hill. It is quiet. Then, in a single instant, the sky tears open. 144 high explosive shells detonate simultaneously. There is no warning. There is no time to duck. The air turns into shrapnel. This was the American answer to the Tiger. You don't duel it. You smash the world it is standing on. Mid-April 1943, the noose is tightening around the Tunisian bridgehead. The fighting moves into the high ground, the Mousetrap Valley, Hill 609. This is the graveyard of the soft American myth. Hill 609 is a flat-topped limestone mesa. It dominates the road to Bizerte. The Germans have turned it into a fortress. They have dug caves into the rock. They have crossfire machine gun nests. They have artillery pre-registered on every approach. The U.S. 34th Infantry Division is assigned to take it. The Red Bulls. They had performed poorly at Kasserine. They had been mocked. They had been told they were weak. Now they were angry. The battle for Hill 609 was not a tank battle. The tanks couldn't get up the cliffs. It was an infantry brawl. It lasted for days. April 29th. Dawn. Private First Class. Tony Ricci is part of the assault. He is carrying a bar, Browning automatic rifle. He weighs 160 pounds. His gear weighs 80. They move up the slope under a smoke screen. The Germans fire blindly into the smoke. Ricci hears the thwack, thwack, thwack of bullets hitting the rocks around him. He keeps moving. They reach the first line of German trenches. It becomes primal. Bayonets, E-tools, helmets used as clubs. The Americans take the lower slopes, but the Germans are still on the top, raining grenades down. The American commander makes a decision, a crazy decision. Get the Shermans up there. Sir, they can't climb that? Get them up. There. The engineers come forward under fire. They blast rock. They fill craters. And slowly, agonizingly, the Sherman tanks of the 751st Tank Battalion start to climb the goat paths. The Germans on the summit look down. They expect infantry. They see 30-ton tanks grinding up a cliff face. The Shermans crest the ridge. They are hull down. They blast the German caves with high explosives at point-blank range. The German defense cracks. The taking of Hill 609 broke the back of the German defensive line in the north. It proved that the American infantryman, when properly led and supported, could dig the Wehrmacht out of the deepest hole. But let's zoom out again. Let's look at the cost. For every hill taken, the casualty list grew. The medical system was overwhelmed. This is where we see the golden hour concept taking shape. The U.S. Army Medical Corps was learning too. They moved surgical hospitals closer to the front. They started using plasma on the battlefield. They realized that if you could treat a shock victim within the first hour, his chances of survival tripled. In World War I, a stomach wound was a death sentence. In Tunisia, men with stomach wounds were surviving, but the psychological toll was mounting. Combat exhaustion, shell shock, battle fatigue. Men were breaking, not because they were cowards, but because the human mind can only process so much terror before it shuts down. Patton didn't believe in it. He famously slapped 2 soldiers in Sicily who were suffering from it. But in Tunisia, the commanders were seeing it for what it was, a casualty of war, just like a bullet wound. The constant noise, the lack of sleep, the smell of unburied bodies rotting in the sun. By May 1943, the men of the II Corps looked like ghosts. Their eyes were the 1,000-yard stare. They didn't talk much. They didn't brag. They just cleaned their weapons and waited for the next order. The Germans were in worse shape. They were trapped against the sea. The Luftwaffe had vanished. The skies belonged to the Allies. The Palm Sunday Massacre. April 18th, 1943. The Germans try to fly in reinforcements. A fleet of Junkers Ju-52 transport planes. Slow, lumbering tri-motor beasts. They are intercepted by 4 squadrons of American P-40 Warhawks and British Spitfires over the Mediterranean. It is not a dogfight. It is a turkey shoot. The Allied pilots queue up to take shots. The Ju-52s, full of fuel and ammunition, explode mid-air. 52 German transport planes are shot down in 20 minutes. Hundreds of German troops drown or burn before they even see Africa. This is the suffocation, the constriction. Rommel is gone. Von Arnim is in charge. He sends a message to Berlin. We have no ammunition. We have no fuel. We are destroying our equipment. Berlin replies, fight to the last cartridge. But the German soldiers in Tunisia are not robots. They are men, and they know when it is over. The collapse, when it came, was sudden. May 6, 1943. The final offensive. Operation Vulcan. The British First Army and the U.S. II Corps launch a simultaneous massive assault. They punch through the final perimeter. They race for Tunis and Bizerte. It is a race between the Allies to see who can get there first. But it is also a race against time for the Germans to destroy their own tech. They spike their guns. They burn their maps. They drive their Tigers into the harbor or blow them up with demolition charges. They do not want the Americans to see the inside of a Tiger. They do not want them to see the optics. But they can't destroy everything. On May 9th, the unimaginable happens. General von Arnim surrenders. But it's not just the surrender of a general. It is the surrender of an army group. Imagine the scene. The roads leading to Tunis are clogged, not with fighting vehicles, but with columns of prisoners. The Americans watch in stunned silence. They expected a fight to the death. They expected a Teutonic Götterdämmerung. Instead, they see relief. German soldiers are laughing. They are trading iron crosses for cigarettes. They are relieved that the war is over for them. One American sergeant, looking at the endless line of prisoners, famously said, "Where the hell did they all come from? And where the hell are we going to put them?" The numbers are staggering. 275,000 Axis prisoners. Let's put that in perspective. At Stalingrad, the Russians captured 91,000 Germans. Tunisia was a bigger disaster for the Axis manpower than Stalingrad. An entire generation of experienced combat troops, the veterans of France and the early Desert War, was gone, erased from the German order of battle. And the equipment. Detailed surveys after the battle found over 500 German tanks destroyed or captured, thousands of trucks, hundreds of artillery pieces. The Afrika Korps ceased to exist. But as the dust settled on the hot Tunisian roads and the GIs finally got to drink a cold beer in Tunis, a question lingered. They had beaten the Germans. Yes, but they had beaten them with overwhelming air power, overwhelming artillery, and overwhelming logistics. They had not yet proven that man for man, tank for tank, they were better. The Tiger was still out there. The Panther was coming. The terrain of Italy would be even worse. The U.S. Army had survived its freshman year. It had passed the exam, but the professors knew that the curriculum was about to get much, much harder. The war moved north, across the water. And waiting on the beaches of Sicily was not just a defeated enemy, but a German command that had analyzed the American tactics in Tunisia and was preparing a bloody welcome mat. The victory in North Africa was absolute, but it was deceptive. It taught the Americans that they could win with weight. It taught the Germans that they could only win with blood. We have reached the end of the shooting. The guns in North Africa have gone cold. The silence that follows a modern battle is heavier than the noise. It rings in your ears. But this is where the real story, the terrifying story, actually begins. Because the most dangerous moment in a war is not when you are losing. It is when you win. When you lose, you question everything. You adapt. You evolve. When you win, you think you have the answers. You think your machines work. You think your doctrine is sound. The victory in Tunisia was a trap, and the United States Army walked right into it. Let's look at the climax of this campaign not as a military triumph, but as a forensic autopsy of a misconception. The title of this story is The Battle of the Best Tank Commanders. But the reveal, the cold, hard truth that reframes every burning tank we have seen so far is that the commanders didn't matter. If you had swapped them, if you had put Rommel in command of the US II Corps and Patton in command of the Africa Corps in January 1943, the result would have been exactly the same. Rommel would have won with the Americans, Patton would have lost with the Germans. Why? Because by 1943, the era of the great captain, the Napoleonic genius who turns the tide of battle with a brilliant maneuver, was dead. It had been killed by the spreadsheet. The climax of the North African campaign wasn't a tactical stroke. It was a triumph of industrial crushing power. Here is the data point that changes the perspective. In the entire North African campaign, the German army lost approximately 2,500 tanks. In the same period, the Allies landed, lost, repaired, and replaced over 7,000. The Germans were fighting a war of quality. The Americans were fighting a war of quantity. The German thesis was, we will build the perfect machine, the Tiger. It will be invincible. One Tiger is worth 10 Shermans. The American thesis was, we will build a good enough machine, the Sherman, and we will build 10,000 of them. And if you kill 10, we will send 11. In Tunisia, the American thesis proved correct, but it proved correct for the wrong reasons. This is the tragedy. The American High Command, specifically Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the head of Army Ground Forces, looked at the reports from Tunisia. He saw that the Americans had won. He saw that the Shermans had defeated the Panzers. He drew the conclusion, the M4 Sherman is adequate. The 75mm gun is sufficient. The tank destroyer doctrine works. He was wrong. The Shermans in Tunisia didn't defeat the Tigers in head-to-head combat. They defeated them because the Tigers ran out of gas. They defeated them because the Tigers were bombed by aircraft. They defeated them because the Tigers were outnumbered 20-1. But McNair didn't see the nuance. He saw the W in the win column. So he froze the development of the American heavy tank. He delayed the deployment of the 76mm gun. He doubled down on the M4. Because of the victory in Tunisia, the U.S. Army went into the invasion of Normandy, Operation Overlord, 1 year later, with the exact same tank that had struggled at Kasserine Pass. They sent men onto the beaches of France in 1944 with a weapon system that was already obsolete in 1943. And when those men met the German panzer divisions in the hedgerows of Normandy, divisions that were fully fueled, fully supplied, and operating on short interior lines, the massacre of Sidi Bouzid happened all over again. Thousands of American tankers burned to death in France because the wrong lesson was learned in Africa. That is the terrifying ripple effect of this story. The victory in the desert signed the death warrants of the men in the bocage. Now let's move to the resolution. The consequences across time. What happened to the men who fought this duel? Rommel, the desert fox, the man who embodied the German tactical genius, went home a broken man. He was disillusioned. He saw the reality of the American industrial monster. He knew Germany could not win. A year later, after being implicated in the plot to kill Hitler, he would be forced to swallow a cyanide capsule in the back of a staff car. The regime he served consumed him. He was a master of the battlefield, but a novice of the moral world. He fought a clean war for a dirty cause, and in the end, the dirt buried him. And Patton? Tunisia was his making. It proved his theory of aggressive war. grab them by the nose, and kick them in the pants. But it also exposed his flaw. He loved war too much. After Tunisia, in the dusty hills of Sicily, he would slap those two shell-shocked soldiers. He would call them cowards. He would nearly lose his career. He was a man built for the sword, not for the peace. He died in a car accident in 1945, paralyzing him from the neck down before his heart gave out. A warrior who died not in battle, but in a hospital bed, terrified of becoming useless. But what about the men? The Sergeant Rossis? The Private Millers? The 1st Armored Division, the old Ironsides, didn't go home. They went to Italy, they fought at Salerno, they fought at Anzio. They fought at Monte Cassino. They spent 2 more years climbing mountains, fighting the same German units they had fought in Tunisia. The survivors of the Africa Corps who were captured, the 270,000 men, were shipped to America. This is a strange, often forgotten chapter. They were put on Liberty ships and sent to Texas, to Oklahoma, to Mississippi. They were put in camps. But the Geneva Convention required that officers be paid and soldiers be fed the same rations as the capturing army. So while the German army in Russia was eating sawdust bread and freezing to death, the prisoners of the Africa Corps in Texas were eating steak, drinking milk, and working on cotton farms. Many of them, after the war, returned to the United States. They became citizens. The man who tried to kill you with an 80-millimeter shell in 1943 might have been your neighbor in Chicago in 1955. That is the strange alchemy of war. It breaks the world apart, and then it glues it back together in weird shapes. But the deepest resolution is found in the shift of the global mindset. Tunisia was the moment the United States accepted the burden of being a superpower. Before 1942, America was an isolationist republic with a small army. After 1943, America was the arsenal of democracy. The logistical miracle of North Africa, the ability to project power, to ship millions of tons of steel and fuel across an ocean, and sustain an army in a desert, became the blueprint for the modern world. We live in the world that logistics built. The container ship, the global supply chain, the projection of force, it was all beta tested in the mud of Tunisia. The American military learned that they didn't need to be better soldiers than the Germans. They just needed to be richer. They needed to be more organized. They needed to turn war from an art into a business. And they did. The German army was a cult of the hero. The American army was a corporation of violence. And as history shows, this corporation always wins. Let's go to the outro. Let's return to where we started. Sidi Bou Zid. Today, the desert has reclaimed the battlefield. The burnt hulks of the Sherman tanks are gone, scrapped by locals decades ago. The foxholes have filled with sand. The cactus patches have grown over the machine gun nests. If you stand there now, you hear only the wind. The same biting wind that blew on that February morning in 1943. It is a peaceful place. Hard to imagine that this was the anvil where the most powerful military force in human history was forged. But if you look closely at the ground, you can still find them. Rusted shell casings, bits of track links, the detritus of the collision. The lesson of the Battle of the Tank Commanders is not about who was better, Patton or Rommel. It is not about the Tiger or the Sherman. It is a lesson about the seduction of technology and the reality of attrition. We love the stories of the aces. We love the Michael Whitmans and the Lafayette G. Pools. We want to believe that individual skill, bravery, and a better gun make the difference. But the story of Tunisia tells us something colder. It tells us that in the industrial age, bravery is a variable, but logistics is a constant. It tells us that you can have the best commander in history, the best tank ever built, and the most disciplined soldiers on earth. But if you cannot feed them, if you cannot fuel them, and if you cannot replace them, you will lose to the machine that can. The Germans had the terror, they had the awe, they had the Tiger, but the Americans had the trucks. And in the end, the truck killed the Tiger. My name is Conrad Vance. This has been the story of the North African Endgame. When you look at a map of the world today, remember the price paid to draw those lines. Remember the boys who burned in the Shermans so that the generals could learn how to run a war.